Hey, Push Nation, welcome in. And I decided to call an audible for this week's Fireside Chat. I'm not going to go into the topic that I thought I was initially, which was on big business. Let's save that for later. For tonight, I want to talk about different groups of people and different forces that were in play that led to further settling the West. And that will actually play in really nicely to Friday's class, which we talked about the burgeoning railroad networks connecting the United States east to Midwest and, of course, the West Coast. So let's talk about first one of the iconic groups of settlers in the West, cowboys. And no, I'm not talking about those choke artists, the Dallas Cowboy football players. I'm talking about the old school cowboys who got their name from one of the more important phenomena that erupted originally out of Texas and other parts of the American Southwest. And these cowboys got their names because they carried out what were known as cattle drives. And these long cattle drives stretched basically from Texas all the way up into the plains areas where the new railroad networks were being built and constructed. And then the railroads in Kansas and the plains area would connect back to the Midwest, specifically Chicago. So understanding the network of the railroads, these cattle drives that cowboys would lead involved thousands and thousands. In fact, it's estimated that in the 1800s, about 20 million cattle were moved, forcibly moved by cowboys and steered towards Kansas and the plains, where they were then put on trains and sent to the East Coast or the Midwest, like I said, in Chicago and places like Cincinnati, which had significant meatpacking districts. These cattle drives are significant in developing the West because you have a great sense of movement and migratory behavior amongst the cowboy community. And here's the overarching theme that applies to the cowboys, but more than that, also the other issues we're going to talk about today in the chat. And that is essentially wherever these cowboys go on these long drives or cattle drives, they have to stop for a place to eat. They have to stop for a place to rest. They have to stop for a place to recharge their batteries. They have to stop for some entertainment. And that leads to the boom of numerous cattle towns or cowboy towns all throughout the Midwest and parts of Texas and wherever else these cattle drives took place. So that is going to be an overarching theme that you'll hear me say with a lot of the examples about settling the West tonight, is that mass movements of people, and even if they weren't mass, because the cattle drives usually could be orchestrated by a handful or dozens of cowboys, it required a new area for them to rest and to settle. And then all of a sudden now these towns are popping up and they became important aspects of the culture of the cowboy community. Now, I'm also going to take a few examples today on the chat and link these back to our heritage here in Arizona, because cattle also became popular. The cattle drives became popular here in Arizona. And so cows were brought in, cows and cattle were brought in from Texas, and they were sent all the way out here to Arizona. And these cowboys deserve a little more credit than they sometimes get. They were pretty forward-thinking in terms of agricultural practice. They crossbred certain cattle, American cattle with European cattle. That's actually where you get the name Longhorn. The Texas Longhorns, that's the University of Texas mascot, the Longhorns. And they also came up with some interesting hybrid strands of grass for the cattle to graze on. So the cowboys would take these cattle, they'd move them towards railroad lines where the cattle could then be shipped off for the slaughterhouses. But one thing that does bear in mind, one of the negative consequences of 20 million cattle grazing and moving throughout the plains is land degradation. And that seems to be a common theme if you think about what we talked about on Friday regarding the railroad constructions. Mother Nature suffered immensely at the hands of the movement in the West, and the cattle just chewed up and chewed up and chewed up land that could have been used for fertile farm ground. So that is one of the negative consequences of the cattle drives. But by and large, the iconic nature of the cattle drives has persisted, especially in Hollywood Westerns. I mean, you see these Western movies, and they feature the cowboys and the cattle drives, and it kind of became a big part of American folklore. And, of course, a lot of that is exaggerated in the Hollywood film industry. But the cattle drives were important in terms of starting towns and cattle drives It certainly created interesting mixtures of people and animals in places that those animals had never really been. And they affect the local economy. They affect the local agricultural scene. And so keep in mind that cowboys, the real root of the cowboy term comes from these cattle drives. Next, I want to talk about farming. And so farming was rapidly improving thanks to technology. And so farmers were beginning to realize what a treasure trove the Great Plains region was. Although in the initial years, farming on the plains was arduous, new soils, technology being worked out. But with the advent of steel and the railroads moving people faster into the West, people began to take much more advantage of the Homestead Act that was passed during the Civil War. And consequently, a whole new generation of American farmers began flocking to the Great Plains. And what they quickly realized is that the fertile soil and the abundance of good weather really made the Great Plains an outstanding place to farm. And quickly, grains and wheats and other important crops, staple food crops, were realized. The farmers realized, these new farmers realized, wow, we can really manufacture and grow these in abundance. And over time, man, thousands of migratory farmers start flocking to the Great Plains. And ultimately, they took advantage of that Homestead Act that was set up by the radical Republicans during the Civil War. And that allowed people to get cheap land cheaply and have their own farms and manage their own farms. And so private farming eventually is going to grow into actually big business in the Midwest. And when we do our theme on big business, we'll talk about these farmers. So realize that farming was being advanced in just a myriad of ways. And again, how does this tie back to the railroads from Friday's class? Well, now these crops can be shipped back to the east or to the west or wherever, thanks to the railroads. And white farmers were able to make lucrative profits if you were fortunate and skilled enough in this endeavor. Now, speaking of the Homestead Act, African Americans also aimed to take advantage of the Homestead Act, primarily because of the horrors of Reconstruction that we talked about at length over the last couple of weeks. One of the first great mass migrations of African Americans from the South to other parts of the country took place in the 1870s. And thousands of African Americans fled from Mississippi and Louisiana and Tennessee and Kentucky. And they moved westward thanks to the railroads for some. Others had to do it old school on foot. But these thousands of African Americans that fled to the Midwest and began lives there and attempting to run away from the issues of the South, they were known as the exodusters. If you ever see that term exodusters, these are specifically related to African Americans who fled the South in the post-Civil War era during Reconstruction, but this is actually a little bit later than Reconstruction, I suppose. And predominantly they went to Kansas and settled in Kansas. In fact, Kansas by the end of the 19th century had 25,000 African Americans, a complete rise from pre-Reconstruction era. Why Kansas? Well, think about the history. During the Bleeding Kansas, Kansas proved to be a great boon to the free soil, free abolition movement. Think about John Brown. He was a hero to many African Americans. So blacks found comfort in going to Kansas. And really, the options were quite limited for African Americans, many of whom did not know skilled labor. So jobs in the North were not readily available, but racism was also increasingly rampant in the North. So a lot of blacks chose Kansas over going to northern cities, and they also chose Kansas over going back to Liberia, which many blacks were still continuing to do, but just not necessarily in the same amount of numbers as they once were. So the Great Plains region, Kansas, Nebraska, start to become heavily populated by farmers and African Americans during the 1870s and 80s. What do they share in common? They took advantage, a lot of them, of the Homestead Act. Mother Nature also proved to be plentiful to many miners, and miners are yet another category of Americans that came pouring into especially the West. So let's go a little bit further west here, outside the Great Plains, and let's specifically get to Nevada, because Nevada, which was already a state, quickly became the center of one of the great booms in mining history, when a silver depository was located, and it became quickly known as the Comstock Lode. L-O-D-E, by the way, on lode, not L-O-A-D, L-O-D-E, the Comstock Lode. The Comstock Lode is one of the great discoveries in American mining history. and it had a very similar effect to the gold rush in California. Thousands of miners came from all over the world to get in on the action, and Nevada quickly became heavily populated by miners. And the mining boom of the Comstock lode lasted for about 15 to 20 years, and then all of a sudden, everybody was trying to and attempting to find the next big mining town. So mining towns, much like the cowboy towns and the cow towns, began to pop up periodically throughout the American West, and especially even here in Arizona. Arizona, which we haven't really talked about because it wasn't a major player yet in the United States, Arizona was put on the map really because of its mining prowess and railroad construction. I'll get to that shortly here by the end of the chat. So Arizona and Nevada, along with other towns in California and whatnot, and New Mexico, basically the general American Southwest, Arizona got on the map because of mining. And the Comstock lode is one specific example. But if you look at our home state, you have towns like Brisbane and Tombstone, and out east towards Apache Junction. I mean, these became popular mining towns with tremendous populations. Jerome up north, and mining towns as far as mining towns go, the population boom was only as good as the mining was. So Arizona experienced a lot of migratory living, as did other parts of the Southwest, because again, if the mining ore deposits dry up, the miners would move on. They'd find another location to do their thing. So mining is incredibly important in terms of keeping the West populated, more and more people going west. And I want to come back to the Chinese, because we talked about the Chinese, and I'm going to talk about another immigrant group, Mexicans, for example. Because here in Arizona, I'll keep it local. One of the goals after the Transcontinental Railroad was built was to build what was known as the Southern Pacific Railroad, and that would connect most of the Southwest to Texas, which of course would connect Texas to the southern states and the East Coast. Tucson was the major hub of the Southern Pacific Railroad here in Arizona, and Tucson, of course, was nearby a lot of mining towns, and so the railroad boom that most of the United States was experiencing also hit Arizona pretty hard, and that meant a demand for labor. So hundreds of Chinese and thousands of Chinese and Mexicans came up north to work on the railroad. And the themes that we talked about today with the Chinese, or Friday with the Chinese, regarding working for less pay, facing racism and nativism, that mirrored their experiences here in Arizona. And actually, if you dig around on the internet, there's a couple websites in Tucson, based in Tucson, historical societies that have published, some documents and photos involving Chinese that moved here to Arizona. And so again, it just kind of mirrors what we talked about on Friday, but also kind of, mixes in some local flavor. To really just sort of put this all together, I mean, all these forces in play, whatever the dynamics are that were demanding people to come out to the West, cattle drives, cowboys, miners, the exodusters, homesteaders, laborers for the railroad, whatever the fact may be, the United States was starting to overpopulate the West, and especially the Southwest. And again, this is all going to lead us towards greater conflict with Native Americans, greater social conflicts with the Chinese, who eventually, the big push is to exclude the Chinese immigrants. While the settlement of the West certainly is going to pave the way for economic, growth and new political developments as well, which we'll be covering shortly. Just bear in mind, here the importance of the railroads, but also that there's a dark side to all these forces that we talked about, and those are just important to see that there's a reaction, equal and opposite reaction to all this. So I'll leave it at that. You guys have the short answer practice in your notebooks. I already emailed that to you guys out. So hopefully you'll find this weekend to be fruitful. If you're taking the SATs, good luck on those. And money. There's Money. He's got his nice sweater on because it's a little chilly here. And there's what we call the Money Shake. So Money making an appearance. You want to say bye? Say goodbye. Say goodbye. Well, I guess he's a little short on words. Perhaps he's a little bit intimidated to see you guys for the first time all year, or the second time, whatever. I don't know how many times he's been on camera. Let's leave it at that. The past shapes the future. Have a great weekend, APUSH Nation.